the quiet outskirts of mid-19th century New York, a grand yet isolated manor sat shrouded in fog and whispers. Its walls, once a symbol of wealth and status, concealed secrets darker than anyone in the nearby village could imagine. Inside lived a man whose reputation as a prosperous landowner masked an unsettling obsession, one that would turn his family into the epicenter of a story whispered with disbelief for generations. The father, a figure both commanding and enigmatic, held authority not only over the estate, but over the lives of his children, in ways that defied societal norms and moral boundaries. His daughters, two sisters known for their beauty and intelligence, navigated a world where familial loyalty intertwined disturbingly with manipulation, fear, and control. From the outside, the household appeared conventional, a portrait of upper class life in 1850s New York. Servants moved quietly through halls lined with oil paintings, and the family attended church and community events with grace and decorum. Yet, behind closed doors, the dynamics were anything but ordinary. The sisters, still in their late teens and early 20s, had been isolated from typical social interactions. Their education focused more on pleasing and obeying than developing independence. Letters they wrote to friends were intercepted, their movements monitored under the guise of propriety and protection. Visitors who stumbled upon the manor often remarked on an uncanny silence, the faint sense of unease in the air, as though the very walls themselves absorbed and reflected the tension within. Neighbors began to notice subtle hints of abnormality. The sisters, once bright and expressive, appeared withdrawn and haunted, often glancing over their shoulders as if anticipating unseen threats. Occasionally, a shadowy figure would be seen pacing the grounds at night, casting long, sinister silhouettes. Against the moonlit estate, rumors began to circulate stories of forbidden arrangements, strange rituals in the manor's private chambers, and unexplained absences of servants and acquaintances. The line between fact and gossip blurred, but one thing became evident: this was no ordinary household. Investigators and historians who later pieced together the story described the father as a man with both charisma and a cold, calculating mind. He was adept at masking his intentions, presenting a benevolent and attentive demeanor to outsiders, while exercising rigid, almost obsessive control over his daughters' lives. Accounts suggest that he manipulated their environment to foster dependency, isolating them from friends and potential suitors, while simultaneously cultivating a perverse intimacy that challenged social, moral, and legal boundaries of the time. It was a psychological labyrinth, where the sisters' autonomy was systematically eroded, leaving them trapped in a carefully constructed web of fear, obligation, and compliance. The atmosphere within the manor was suffused with tension, a quiet horror that intensified as the sisters aged and the father's demands escalated. Evening meals were formal yet strained, with polite conversation masking an underlying dread. The sisters spoke in hushed tones, their laughter rare and fleeting, replaced by a vigilant watchfulness for signs of disapproval. Servants reported hearing whispers in corridors, doors closing without explanation, and the occasional inexplicable cry from one of the daughters. Each incident, while small in isolation, contributed to a growing sense of unease that would later define the manor's reputation. As the story unfolded, historians have noted the convergence of psychological manipulation, social isolation, and patriarchal dominance that culminated in one of the most disturbing family scandals of the era. The sisters' experiences reveal the vulnerabilities inherent in a rigidly hierarchical society, where wealth and authority could conceal abuses that were both intimate and systemic. The house itself, an imposing edifice of brick and timber, became a silent witness to the erosion of boundaries, morality, and the daughter's sense of self. Its walls held the echoes of whispered confessions, muffled sobs, and moments of fleeting rebellion that were quickly suppressed. And yet, despite the darkness, the story is not merely one of victimhood. It is a tale of endurance, of the human spirit's capacity to navigate terror and complexity within the confines of family and society. The sisters, though manipulated and coerced, exhibited resilience in small acts of defiance, moments of subtle resistance that hinted at inner strength and awareness. These glimpses of autonomy, often overlooked in historical accounts, suggest that even in the shadowed corridors of oppression, the seeds of agency and self-preservation could persist. The manor's reputation spread beyond the local community, attracting attention from clergy, legal authorities, and eventually journalists seeking to uncover the full extent of the household's secrets. Yet each revelation seemed only to deepen the mystery, adding layers of psychological intrigue, cultural context, and ethical ambiguity. Observers struggled to reconcile the sisters' apparent complicity with the coercion they endured, grappling with the complex interplay of fear, loyalty, and survival in a time when women's choices were severely constrained by societal expectations. By the time the story reached the broader public, the manor had already become a symbol, a cautionary emblem of what could happen when unchecked authority, isolation, and obsession converged in the private sphere. It represented not just a scandal, but a lens through which historians and psychologists alike could examine the dark intersections of family, power, and morality in mid-19th century America. The narrative that began within the walls of a seemingly ordinary New York household would echo for decades, a chilling reminder that horror often resides not in distant lands or violent strangers, but in the quiet spaces of familiar homes, where control, secrecy, and fear intertwine with devastating effect. In the mid-19th century, New York was a state of contrasts. Urban centers like New York City thrived with commerce, immigration, and technological advancements, while rural regions retained traditions, social hierarchies, and tightly knit communities that valued reputation and propriety above all else. Within these rural enclaves, families of wealth and influence often wielded near absolute authority over household affairs, guided by social conventions that reinforced patriarchal dominance. The manor where the sisters lived stood on the outskirts of a small town, isolated enough to maintain privacy yet close enough to participate in community life, striking a delicate balance between exposure and seclusion. The father, head of his family and owner of the estate, was a product of these social norms. Wealth and status afforded him autonomy and credibility in the eyes of neighbors, clergy, and even law enforcement. His control extended beyond property to the personal lives of those within his household. During this era, women's rights were severely restricted. Education for daughters was often limited to subjects deemed suitable for domestic life: music, embroidery, basic literacy, and manners. They were trained to please, to marry advantageously, and to uphold family honor. Independence was rare, and societal structures made it difficult for young women to escape the influence of their fathers or male relatives. The sisters, born into this context, were products of both privilege and confinement. Their upbringing was tightly regimented, with lessons emphasizing obedience and propriety. Yet the physical environment of the manor amplified the psychological pressures of their domestic education. The house, sprawling and labyrinthine, allowed the father to monitor the daughter's movements with ease. Hidden corridors, thick walls, and a staff loyal to the family created an ecosystem in which deviation from prescribed behavior was both difficult and perilous. The isolation not only protected the father's reputation, but also nurtured the environment for the darker manipulations that would later define the scandal. New York in 1850 also existed in a period of heightened moral scrutiny. Religious institutions exerted considerable influence over community behavior. Sermons on virtue, propriety, and the sanctity of family reinforced the patriarchal model and served as social checkpoints for acceptable conduct. In the context of this morality, the father's outward appearance of devoutness and adherence to social norms allowed him to deflect suspicion and maintain the veneer of respectability. Publicly, he was a model citizen, attending church, contributing to civic matters, and participating in local social functions. Privately, however, his authority over the household was exercised in ways that violated ethical, moral, and legal expectations. Economic factors further contributed to the environment of control. Wealth in mid-19th century New York was a marker of power, granting families access to education, influence, and political connections. The father leveraged these advantages to maintain dominance, not only within his household, but in interactions with the surrounding community. Servants, many of whom were bound by economic necessity and loyalty, became unwitting enforcers of his control, further isolating the daughters from external perspectives. The convergence of wealth, isolation, and social expectation created a breeding ground for coercion, psychological manipulation, and ultimately, exploitation. Culturally, the period was marked by a fascination with propriety, lineage, and inheritance. Marriages were often arranged to consolidate wealth, ensure social stability, or strengthen family ties. The sisters' existence in such a context made them particularly vulnerable. Their upbringing had not fostered independent decision-making. Instead, it cultivated reliance on the father's judgment. Social norms discouraged rebellion and emphasized familial duty, making acts of defiance psychologically and socially challenging. In this environment, the father's increasingly controlling behavior could flourish with little oversight, leaving the daughters trapped in a web of authority, expectation, and secrecy. The intersection of psychology and societal norms provides a lens for understanding the events within the manor. Studies in historical psychology suggest that prolonged isolation combined with authoritarian control can erode personal boundaries, foster dependency, and diminish the ability to recognize abuse. The sisters' experiences reflect these dynamics. Nurtured in a world where obedience was paramount, isolated from peers, and consistently monitored, their capacity to resist or even identify the abnormality of their situation was severely compromised. The house itself, with its imposing architecture and hidden spaces, served not only as a residence but as a physical manifestation of the father's control, reinforcing the psychological imprisonment of his daughters. The historical record, supplemented by letters, diaries, and local accounts, paints a picture of life inside the manor that is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its attention to domestic duties, appearances, and community engagement. Extraordinary in the manipulation, secrecy, and boundary violations that define the private sphere. Scholars have noted that the case offers a rare insight into the intersection of gender, power, and morality in 19th century America, highlighting how social and cultural structures could inadvertently enable abuse while maintaining an appearance of normalcy. By situating the story of the sisters within the broader historical, cultural, and social context of New York in 1850, one can begin to understand the complexities of their predicament. The manor, the father's authority, the sisters' constrained education, and the surrounding moral framework all combined to create a setting in which control, secrecy, and manipulation could thrive. What unfolded within these walls was not merely a family scandal. It was a reflection of broader societal dynamics, revealing how gender, power, and social expectation intersected to shape lives, limit autonomy, and in some cases facilitate horrors hidden behind a veneer of respectability. Through this lens, the manor becomes more than a location. It becomes a symbol of the era's tensions between social propriety and private transgression, between outward morality and inward corruption. The story of the sisters is inseparable from the historical fabric of mid-19th century New York, a narrative that illuminates both the societal constraints imposed upon women and the dangerous consequences of unchecked patriarchal authority. The threads of culture, economy, and psychology weave together, providing a comprehensive backdrop that frames the chilling events that would soon unfold, setting the stage for the horrifying incidents that define the manor's infamous legacy. The events inside the manor unfolded like a dark rhythm, a sequence of escalating control, fear, and subtle horror that defined the sisters' daily existence. Initially, the episodes seemed ordinary to outsiders: small punishments, reprimands, and restrictions on social interactions. But each incident, though subtle on the surface, carried undertones of manipulation that gradually eroded the sisters' sense of autonomy. Tasks that should have been simple, visiting a neighbor, attending a church gathering, or walking in the gardens, became fraught with surveillance and veiled threats. The father's presence was constant, his watchful eyes in every corner, his voice a steady reminder of the consequences of disobedience. The sisters learned to navigate this silent terror, understanding that any deviation, however minor, could provoke punishment or humiliation. One afternoon, a young servant attempted to deliver a letter from a friend to the eldest sister. the father intercepted it with uncanny precision. He read the contents aloud, his tone calm yet laden with menace, exposing the youngest sister's whispered thoughts to the scrutiny of the household. The sister's embarrassment was palpable, a quiet anguish that echoed through the manor's corridors. In that moment, the power imbalance crystallized. The father's authority extended not only to physical control, but to the psychological dominion over private thoughts. The sisters learned that secrecy was impossible and that compliance was the only shield against his oppressive gaze. Later incidents intensified the sisters' confinement. One evening, the father barred the sisters from participating in a local festival, citing propriety and protection. Yet it was evident to those observing the manor that the restriction served a darker purpose, limiting exposure to potential allies or suitors who might intervene on their behalf. As the sisters' social circle shrank, their isolation deepened. The manor itself became a stage for intimidation, furniture rearranged to monitor movement, mirrors angled to reflect every passage, and hallways that echoed with the father's silent presence. Each adjustment, each command, reinforced the suffocating atmosphere, turning ordinary domestic spaces into instruments of psychological surveillance. Physical incidents, though less frequent, were equally disturbing. A slip on the grand staircase became a lesson in fear and obedience rather than mere accident. The father's calm reprimand masked a deliberate intention to instill caution and vigilance beyond normal caution. Similarly, minor disagreements over household duties or minor errors in etiquette were met with disproportionate correction. A stern lecture, a closed door, or a temporary removal of privileges. These moments, seemingly mundane, layered over time, contributed to a persistent quiet terror that defined the sisters' experience. As the sisters matured, the father's demands escalated to morally and socially taboo territory. Intimate boundaries, once respected, were blurred under the guise of paternal guidance and familial duty. The sisters, already conditioned to obedience, found themselves trapped in a complex web of fear, manipulation, and coerced compliance. The manor, once a place of potential refuge, had transformed into a psychological labyrinth, where every room, hallway, and shadow carried implications for their behavior, safety, and sense of self. They learned to anticipate the father's moods, to modulate expressions in speech, and to navigate interactions with precision to avoid retribution. Incidents extended beyond mere psychological pressure. The father engineered circumstances that forced the sisters into situations they could neither refuse nor escape. Invitations to social events were accompanied by explicit threats or conditional permissions that tied attendance to personal compliance. These orchestrations were subtle yet powerful, gradually eroding resistance and embedding fear. Visitors who chanced upon the manor noticed the tension, the careful choreography of interaction, and the sisters' wary eyes that seemed to search for an unseen danger in every gesture. The external world perceived decorum and civility, but inside, the sisters navigated a landscape of silent terror. Minor household mishaps were also weaponized to maintain control. A spilled tea, a misplaced garment, or a delayed response became opportunities for the father to assert dominance. He framed these incidents as lessons in responsibility, yet they carried an undercurrent of intimidation. Servants and household staff, complicit through loyalty or fear, reinforced the father's authority by observing, reporting, and occasionally enacting punishments. The sisters' every move was scrutinized, their reactions catalogued, and their compliance measured against an invisible standard of obedience. Even the garden, once a space of leisure and freedom, became a monitored area where wandering too far or speaking too freely could provoke correction. Occasionally, the sisters sought solace in small acts of defiance, a whispered conversation behind closed doors, a fleeting smile at an unobserved moment, or a secret glance exchanged across a room. These gestures, though minor, represented the persistence of autonomy within an oppressive environment. Yet each act was fraught with risk, and discovery could result in immediate consequences. The father's surveillance was both subtle and pervasive, a presence in doorways, a shadow in mirrors, or an unexpected entrance into private chambers. These encounters maintained a constant undercurrent of fear, shaping behavior, expression, and thought. Over time, the psychological toll manifested in visible ways. The sisters' health and emotional states fluctuated with the intensity of control, isolation, and coercion. Sleep was often disturbed by anticipation of the father's scrutiny. Meals, once routine, became occasions of anxiety. Even conversation carried layers of caution, self-censorship, and fear of reprisal. The manor, a silent witness to these episodes, absorbed the tension, its walls reflecting the weight of secrets, compliance, and restrained rebellion. Observers from outside noted the sisters' increasingly withdrawn demeanor, their hesitancy, and the haunting quality of their gaze, an unsettling testament to the relentless psychological environment within. Each incident, whether minor or severe, contributed to a cumulative portrait of oppression, manipulation, and constrained agency. The sisters' lives became a delicate balance between compliance and subtle resistance, between survival and the faint hope of autonomy. The father's influence was absolute within the household, but the sisters' internal world retained fragments of awareness, resilience, and defiance. These moments, though fleeting and often unnoticed, offer glimpses into the complex human response to sustained control, coercion, and moral transgression within the private sphere. The pattern of incidents, repeated and intensified over years, created a narrative that combined ordinary domestic life with extraordinary psychological horror. Visitors, neighbors, and even extended family members were left puzzled by the sisters' behavior, the father's enigmatic presence, and the atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the manor. The incidents were neither random nor purely punitive. They were calculated, deliberate, and sustained, forming a web of influence and control that defined the daily existence of the sisters. The manor, a once vibrant center of family life, had become a theater of quiet terror, a place where ordinary routines concealed extraordinary psychological and moral transgressions. By the time the broader scandal emerged, the accumulated incidents, both subtle and overt, had irrevocably shaped the sisters' lives, identities, and social perception. Each event, from intercepted letters to orchestrated social constraints, contributed to a deep, enduring tension that historians now recognize as a textbook illustration of coercive control, patriarchal dominance, and the insidious effects of psychological manipulation in a socially constrained 19th century setting. The manor's corridors, rooms, and gardens, once spaces of potential freedom, had become instruments of fear, shaping not just the sisters' actions, but their thoughts, emotions, and very sense of self. As whispers of the sisters' unusual circumstances began to circulate beyond the manor walls, the community's reaction was a complex mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and moral judgment. Neighbors and townspeople struggled to reconcile the outward appearance of a respectable family with the disturbing hints of impropriety and coercion that gradually emerged. Conversations in local markets, churches, and public gatherings often carried a tone of cautious speculation. People referred to the family in hushed tones, sharing fragmented observations about the sisters' withdrawn demeanor, the father's controlling presence, and the peculiar arrangement of daily life within the manor. For many, the idea that such a private household could harbor such extreme behaviors was difficult to comprehend. Local newspapers, when reporting on incidents that hinted at the household's dark secrets, employed a measured tone, balancing journalistic curiosity with societal sensitivity. Articles described the father's authority over the family, the sisters' limited social interactions, and the growing rumors about moral and social transgressions. While some journalists treated the stories as sensational gossip, others took a more investigative approach, seeking to understand the social and psychological dynamics at play. These early reports often relied on testimony from servants, neighbors, and visitors who had glimpsed the manor's inner workings, providing a fragmented yet compelling portrait of the household's hidden reality. Among the clergy and moral authorities, reactions were marked by concern and calls for intervention. Pastors who had interacted with the family reported observing signs of distress, obedience born of fear, and subtle indications of psychological manipulation. Sermons in nearby churches occasionally referenced the situation indirectly, cautioning congregants against moral corruption, familial abuse, and the dangers of unchecked authority within private households. These reflections contributed to a broader societal awareness, framing the sisters' predicament not just as a private family matter, but as a moral and ethical concern for the community at large. Psychologists and scholars, though, in the early Stages of formal study during the mid-19th century attempted to interpret the sisters' behaviors through emerging theories of mental health and human development. Observers noted the impact of prolonged coercion, isolation, and moral pressure on the sisters' emotional and cognitive states. Reports highlighted symptoms of anxiety, heightened vigilance, and the subtle ways in which the sisters adapted to a life constrained by both fear and manipulation. These early analyses, while rudimentary by modern standards, underscored the interplay between environment, authority, and individual psychology within a confined domestic setting. Family members and extended relatives displayed a mixture of loyalty, disbelief, and embarrassment. Some attempted discreet interventions, offering counsel or opportunities for social engagement, only to encounter resistance from the father or subtle manipulation that rendered their efforts ineffective. Others distanced themselves from the situation entirely, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable reality or risk entanglement in familial scandal. The tension between private loyalty and public perception created a layered social landscape, in which the sisters' experiences became both highly scrutinized and largely misunderstood by those beyond the manor's walls. Community response also reflected broader societal attitudes toward gender, authority, and family structure in mid-19th century New York. Women's autonomy was limited, and patriarchal authority was often legally and socially sanctioned, making the sisters' predicament particularly complex. While observers recognized the coercion and manipulation, they struggled to identify avenues for intervention that would be both effective and socially acceptable. This dynamic contributed to a pervasive sense of helplessness and moral ambiguity among those who became aware of the sisters' plight. Visitors to the manor, traders, clergy, or traveling acquaintances were acutely aware of the tension permeating the household. They reported an eerie combination of politeness and underlying fear in the sisters' interactions, a careful choreography of speech, gaze, and movement designed to avoid triggering the father's scrutiny. Outsiders' accounts often emphasized the palpable atmosphere of anxiety and suppression, noting that the sisters' comportment conveyed volumes about the invisible pressures shaping their daily lives. These descriptions became essential pieces of the broader narrative, corroborating evidence of the father's pervasive control while also capturing the subtle resilience exhibited by the sisters. The public discourse surrounding the family's situation extended to moral and ethical debates. Local meetings, private discussions, and occasional letters to editors grappled with questions of legality, propriety, and intervention. Should the community challenge the father's authority? Was it appropriate to intrude on a private household? How could the sisters be protected within the bounds of social and legal norms of the time? These debates highlighted the tension between communal responsibility and individual autonomy, reflecting a society in which social oversight existed, but was constrained by custom, law, and limited understanding of psychological manipulation. Newspaper correspondents and early investigators compiled records and anecdotal evidence, creating a partial documentary trail that future historians would draw upon. While much remained, hidden due to the private nature of the household and the sisters' reluctance to speak openly, these accounts collectively painted a portrait of a family life dominated by coercion and psychological control. Observers emphasized both the severity of the father's influence and the subtle acts of endurance and adaptation by the sisters, providing a nuanced understanding of the interplay between authority, compliance, and resilience. In conclusion, the reaction of society to the sisters' experiences was multifaceted, encompassing curiosity, concern, moral judgment, and scholarly investigation. Neighbors, clergy, journalists, and family members each engaged with the unfolding narrative in ways shaped by social norms, legal frameworks, and personal ethics. Through their observations, interventions, and debates, the broader community contributed to the complex historical record that illuminates the dynamics of power, control, and survival within the confined, oppressive environment of the manor. The sisters' story, mediated through public perception and societal response, became both a cautionary tale and a compelling study of human behavior under extreme domestic constraint. These reactions offer contemporary audiences a window into the ethical, psychological, and cultural dimensions of 19th century American society, highlighting the tension between private experience and public scrutiny, between coercion and resilience, and between moral responsibility and social constraint. The tension that had simmered for years within the manor finally reached a terrifying crescendo one autumn evening, when a series of events converged to expose the true horror of the sisters' existence. The household, usually shrouded in strict routines and unspoken rules, began to fracture under the pressure of secrecy and suppression. A local traveling merchant, unfamiliar with the subtle codes of fear that governed the manor, arrived at the property late in the day, unaware of the oppressive authority that held the household captive. The father, ever vigilant, immediately perceived the merchant's presence as a potential threat, fearing intrusion into his meticulously controlled environment. The sisters, accustomed to tiptoeing around his moods, sensed the impending danger and moved through the corridors with cautious urgency, their movements silent yet deliberate. As night descended, the shadows within the manor deepened and the atmosphere thickened with dread. The flickering candlelight cast distorted shapes on the walls, elongating the figures of the sisters and the father into ghostly silhouettes that seemed almost otherworldly. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every whisper of wind through the eaves heightened the tension. In this oppressive silence, the father's authority became almost tangible, a weight pressing down on every action and thought within the household. The sisters' hearts pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Years of psychological manipulation had honed their awareness to a near supernatural level, making them hypersensitive to the slightest irregularity. The first act that shattered the fragile calm was a confrontation in the parlor. The merchant, unaware of the familial dynamics, attempted casual conversation, noting the sisters' unusual demeanor and the palpable tension that hung in the air. The father's reaction was immediate and severe, a controlled yet menacing display of dominance. His voice, calm but laced with authority, demanded compliance and punished the slightest deviation from expected behavior. The sisters, caught between terror and instinct, maneuvered through the conversation with delicate precision, balancing honesty with concealment. The merchant, sensing an undercurrent of fear but unable to fully understand its source, pressed, further inadvertently provoking the father's wrath. In an instant, the household erupted into controlled chaos. Objects were overturned in the parlor as the father's fury manifested in a violent display meant to reassert dominance. The sisters, driven by both fear and years of suppressed emotion, acted instinctively to protect themselves and each other. One sister, trembling yet resolute, attempted to shield the merchant from harm, while the other tried to deflect the father's aggression, using the furniture and layout of the room as barriers. The interplay of shadow, movement, and light transformed the room into a cinematic scene of suspense. Each step, each gesture magnified by the intensity of fear and the stakes of survival. The confrontation escalated into the upper floors, where the father pursued the sisters through narrow hallways and staircases. The old wood groaned underfoot, each creak echoing like a warning through the silent manor. The sisters, guided by a mix of instinct and desperation, navigated secret passages and hidden alcoves known only to them. These narrow, labyrinthine corridors had been their refuge for years, yet tonight they carried a new sense of urgency. The shadows themselves seemed to follow, casting grotesque forms that mirrored the sisters' terror. Every moment was stretched into an eternity, as if time itself slowed under the weight of imminent disaster. Meanwhile, the merchant, now partially understanding the peril, attempted to intervene, but his presence complicated the situation further. The father, perceiving any interference as a threat to his authority, responded with calculated aggression, his movements precise yet terrifying in their intensity. The sisters, trapped between loyalty, fear, and survival, displayed a rare unity, coordinating their movements to create openings and escape routes. Their training in subtlety and restraint, cultivated over years of silent compliance, became a tool of resistance in this sudden crisis. The clash of authority, fear, and instinct transformed the manor into a theater of suspense, each moment laden with psychological tension. Outside, the night deepened, and the ambient sounds of the surrounding neighborhood seemed to recede, leaving the manor isolated in a cocoon of suspense. Windows rattled in their frames, wind whistled through the trees, and distant church bells tolled intermittently, marking the passage of time with an eerie rhythm. Within the manor, the echoes of confrontation reverberated through walls and hallways, a haunting symphony of fear and control. The sisters, aware that exposure could lead to irreparable consequences, balanced their instinct for self-preservation with the necessity of shielding the merchant. Their actions, measured and deliberate, reflected a deep understanding of both the psychological and physical dimensions of the crisis. As the climax reached its apex, the father's authority was simultaneously challenged and reinforced. The sisters' subtle acts of defiance, guided by desperation and courage, began to erode the absolute control he had maintained for decades. Yet the intensity of his presence, both commanding and terrifying, remained palpable. The interplay of light, shadow, sound, and movement created an atmosphere where each decision, each gesture, carried immense weight. The manor, once a symbol of secrecy and oppression, now stood as a crucible in which the hidden dynamics of power, fear, and resilience were brought into stark relief. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the household settled into an uneasy calm. The sisters, exhausted yet alert, reflected on the events that had unfolded, aware that the boundaries of authority had shifted, even if only marginally. The merchant, now fully cognizant of the household's dark reality, departed with a mixture of shock, empathy, and lingering fear. The father, though outwardly composed, experienced an internal disruption to the order he had so meticulously maintained. The manor, scarred by the night's events, retained the echoes of confrontation, a lingering testimony to the collision of power, fear, and subtle resistance. This climactic sequence, while intensely dramatic, also serves as a lens through which to examine broader historical and psychological dynamics. The sisters' resilience, the father's exercise of authority, and the community's peripheral awareness converge to illustrate the complex interplay of coercion, adaptation, and survival within 19th century domestic hierarchies. The tension, fear, and subtle heroism of the sisters become emblematic of human endurance in the face of oppressive control, offering a compelling narrative that resonates both emotionally and intellectually. Ultimately, the climactic events of that autumn night crystallized the thematic core of the sisters' story: the tension between dominance and resistance, fear and courage, secrecy and exposure. The manor, its walls bearing silent witness, becomes a character in its own right, a repository of history, trauma, and subtle triumph. In this moment, the psychological landscape of 19th century familial control is rendered tangible, immersive, and hauntingly memorable, leaving an indelible impression on anyone who peers into the shadowed corridors of this remarkable yet tragic story. In the days, months, and years following the climactic night within the manor, the long shadows cast by the father's authority lingered over both the sisters and the surrounding community. Though the immediate confrontation had passed, the psychological and social repercussions continued to ripple outward, affecting not only the household but also the broader perceptions of morality, family, and human resilience. The sisters, having survived a confrontation that tested their instincts, courage, and unity, found themselves navigating a delicate balance between cautious freedom and persistent fear. Their behaviors remained marked by a combination of learned submission, acute vigilance, and subtle acts of personal empowerment, a complex interplay that revealed the enduring impact of years of coercion. Within the local community, the story of the sisters' plight became a subject of lingering fascination and speculation. Neighbors, clergy, and journalists recounted fragments of events with a mixture of awe, horror, and incredulity. Yet much of the household's true dynamics remained hidden, protected by layers of secrecy, social expectation, and the sisters' own cautious discretion. As decades passed, the details of the father's control, the psychological conditioning, and the sisters' endurance were pieced together from sporadic accounts, letters, and legal records, creating a mosaic that was simultaneously revealing and incomplete. The story occupied a space between documented history and folklore, capturing the imagination of those who sought to understand the extremes of domestic life in 19th century New York. Psychologists and historians, reviewing these accounts from a modern perspective, have emphasized the complex psychological dimensions of the sisters' experience. Prolonged exposure to coercive control, restricted autonomy, and emotional manipulation left enduring marks on their mental and emotional states. The sisters' adaptive strategies, including heightened awareness, compartmentalization, and calculated compliance, illustrate both vulnerability and resilience. Contemporary analysis also situates the story within broader social structures, highlighting how patriarchal authority, limited legal recourse, and societal norms regarding family privacy constrained the possibilities for intervention and support. The epilogue, therefore, becomes a reflection not only on individual endurance, but also on systemic influences that shaped the environment in which the sisters lived. The manor itself, silent yet omnipresent, continued to stand as a testament to the complicated interplay of power and survival. Its walls bore witness to both oppression and quiet resistance, carrying echoes of fear, courage, and enduring human complexity. Visitors and descendants who later passed through the halls reported an intangible weight, a lingering sense of the past's presence. These testimonies reinforce the notion that physical spaces can serve as repositories of collective memory and emotional history, preserving the subtle nuances of events that might otherwise fade from written record. Speculation regarding the sisters' later lives remains, in some respects, unresolved. Some accounts suggest that they eventually married outside the family, seeking to forge independent lives despite the indelible imprint of their upbringing. Others propose that the psychological effects of their early experiences shaped their choices and relationships in ways that were never fully visible to outsiders. The ambiguity surrounding their ultimate fate adds to the haunting quality of the narrative, reinforcing the tension between documented events and the unknown, between observable reality and the invisible impact of prolonged psychological manipulation. Beyond individual outcomes, the broader implications of the story resonate with ongoing questions about human behavior, ethics, and social responsibility. The sisters' experiences offer a case study in the effects of coercive control within family structures, the strategies of survival employed by individuals in oppressive environments, and the ethical dilemmas faced by communities when confronting hidden abuse. These reflections bridge historical context and contemporary relevance, demonstrating how lessons from the past can inform understanding of power, resilience, and moral accountability in any era. In conclusion, the story of the sisters, who became their father's brides, remains a deeply unsettling yet instructive episode in 19th century American history. It invites reflection on the boundaries of authority, the capacities for endurance and adaptation under duress, and the enduring mysteries that surround human behavior in extreme circumstances. The manor, the family, and the subtle dynamics of control and resistance leave an indelible imprint, reminding us that history is not only a chronicle of events but also a repository of human experience, fraught with complexity, tension, and enduring questions. In the silence of the manor's halls, in the shadows of recorded testimony, and in the lingering ambiguity of the sisters' fate, the story persists haunting, instructive, and impossible to fully comprehend.